Hey everybody, I'm Chelo Siki, and we are going to be talking about rainwater harvesting today. So we're going to be looking at rainwater harvesting and the benefits of rainwater harvesting, and then giving you some intensive and some other very easy strategies to implement rainwater harvesting on your projects. So with rainwater harvesting, we're going to go through the various ways that we can do it. And again, some very intensive and then some very simple and easy. Now, when we do this on our landscapes, typically we're doing this to benefit our landscapes, whether we're storing some water that we've collected off of our roof during the rainy season for use in the dry season, or we're installing a rain garden to be able to purify and store water and get some deeper infiltration into our landscape during the rainy season. A lot of ways to do it, but a lot of times we think of this as the benefits to our landscape. And yes, one benefit is reserving water for use later in the season. One benefit is providing a beautiful element in your landscape. Another one can be increasing water infiltration and storage in your soils, right? So all great benefits to your landscape, your plants, etc. But we also have to think about the benefits to the watershed that this can do. Okay, so when we install or implement any kind of rainwater harvesting system into our landscape and onto our property, we're reducing our stormwater runoff volume. Okay, and I'll go into the importance of that in just a minute here. We're reducing pollutants flowing into our streams, creeks, and rivers, keeping our waterways clean. And we're increasing our water infiltration into our soil. And that's a really big one. So landscapes can be green filters, or landscapes can be gray funnels. In the green filter landscapes, pollutants are filtered as rainwater slowly infiltrates into the ground through a well-developed soil structure. Our gray funnels are primarily impermeable surfaces. So in our urban environments, we have a lot of impermeable surface. The result of that is much higher runoff, just because we've covered our roads with asphalt and our sidewalks with concrete, right? Now, let's talk about what the result is. In the green filter, the natural setting, and I know in Sacramento County, there's a lot of new developments, old developments, developments just about to be put in. But the really wonderful thing about Sacramento County is that not very far away, there's great open space, right? There's space that is in practically its old original natural state. In that natural state, here's what normally happens. When we get a rainfall event, we get about 50% of that water going down into the soil, 25% of that being shallow infiltration, and 25% being deep infiltration. 40% is lost through evapotranspiration, right? So through evaporation and transpiration of water vapor through trees and plants. 10% of that ends up being runoff, which ends up going to our creeks, streams, and our rivers. Now we put in an urban environment with a lot of impermeable surfaces. The result is kind of interesting. First result we'll look at is that infiltration. Of course, our infiltration is going to go significantly down because we've got impermeable surfaces. So you see we get 10% to shallow infiltration and 5% to deep infiltration. Our evapotranspiration hasn't changed that much. It's only gone down by about 10%. The reason for that is water still evaporates off of concrete and asphalt, but the loss that we have is a significant reduction in the plant material. So we have very little evapotranspiration, or transpiration out of the plants. Sorry, we do have evaporation, but very little transpiration. And so that's primarily the reason for the drop from the 40% down to the 30%. Well, if we lose 10% of our potential evapotranspiration and we lose 35% of our deep and shallow infiltration, what do we end up with? We end up with heavier runoff, 55%, right? So the 35% less infiltration, the 10% less evapotranspiration gets added to that 10% natural runoff. We end up with 55% of our stormwater as runoff going into our storm drains, into our creeks and streams and rivers. So this is a really significant thing. Now, strategies to reduce the amount of runoff, and when we have runoff in our urban environments, we have pollutants. There's pollutants on our roofs. There's pollutants on our roadways, our sidewalks, etc., right? This can be in the form of oils and automobile fluids that have fallen onto the roadways. This can be in the form of airborne heavy metal pollutants that are in our air and settle on our concrete and our roofs. And when water hits that, it goes into that water soluble, and then it flows into our storm drains, our creeks, our streams, our rivers. So we have a significant amount higher volume of water in our urban environments and significantly higher pollutant loads in that runoff. And we're going to talk about some strategies to reduce that in our urban environments. So when we have this condition, when this becomes this, we need some strategies to do this. Okay, so we can't really reverse this urbanization. We can make better choices moving forward with how we build, with low impact development and green stormwater infrastructures, etc. But for 100 years or more, we've been urbanizing in a way that significantly increases runoff and our pollutant loads in that runoff. Now, we can implement very simple or sometimes intensive strategies to reduce our runoff and lower our pollutant loads going into our waterways. So when our natural ground cover settings become urbanized ground cover settings with high impervious coverage, high runoff volume, and high pollutant loads, anywhere that we possibly can in our landscapes, on our properties, to correct that and minimize that, we're benefiting our waterways. Okay, so we're going to go through those strategies. Strategies that we're going to talk about are rain barrels, mulch basins, rain gardens, and porous pavements or permeable paving. First, talking about rain barrels. Using rain barrels, we're reserving water for use later in the season. This directly reduces the amount of storm water flowing into our waterways. Okay. Now, cool little rule of thumb here. You get 62 gallons of water for every 100 square feet of surface area that you can collect from a single inch of rain. So thinking back to some of our previous winters, how many inches of rain did we get? Well, if you're collecting off a 100 square foot area, then multiply that amount by this 62, less a couple losses that we'll talk about, and you can consider how much water you could store for future use. Now, that water when you're using it in the future, it's not going to be runoff water. You're applying that directly to the landscape, benefiting your soil and your plants. Again, that's a benefit to your landscape, but you also need to consider how much of an insignificant benefit that is for our waterways. Every little bit helps. So looking at these systems, rainwater stored for use in landscapes is considered non-potable. This isn't something that we drink. Rainwater systems may not be connected to potable water sources, and the potable source must be protected by an approved backflow prevention device or an air gap. Okay, so if we're storing this water that we're collecting off of the roof or other impermeable surfaces, and then we're pumping it into irrigation systems, which is kind of an intensive way to do it. But if we're doing that, we have to make sure that those systems are not cross-connected and that there's a backflow prevention device on the potable system. Okay, so it's very important not to cross-contaminate these waters. Of course, this isn't like a reclaimed water coming from a sewage plant. This is rainwater, which we generally think of as clean, but as soon as it goes across our roofs or across our concrete and into some sort of storage container, we've got polluted water that we do not want to drink and we don't want to mix with our potable water. Only collect water from the roof. There are other ways to collect it, but if we're storing it, only collect it off of the roof. Make sure that you're aware of mosquito prevention. Provide 16th inch grid screens with 16th inch openings so that we don't end up with mosquito issues. And then those storage tanks should be some sort of opaque or dark color so that we avoid algae growth. We don't want sunlight hitting that water so that we get excessive algae growth within that. So looking at rain barrels, here's some relatively simple systems. These are just simple 55-gallon barrels in series connected with bulkhead fittings. This right here is a bulkhead fitting. Okay, so this makes it so that you can connect a threaded pipe through some sort of tank. Okay, here's another, and these are in sequence. So this is dumping the water from the downspout into this tank. There's pipes that connect these together. And as this one fills up with the water from the downspout, it goes through the pipe and fills this one up, goes through the pipe and fills this one up, goes through the pipe and fills this one up. When it's finally full, right, it can come out of this pipe here, okay? Very simple system. Here's another simple system where there's a larger tank and we've got a leaf diverter. It's coming off of the roof gutter system. A lot of times we get leaves and debris in that. So we want to filter that out so we don't end up with leaves and debris in our tank. There's the storage tank, and then there's also an intake pressure pressure pump here as well. Okay, so one other thing that I didn't point out, and there's a couple subsequent pictures here. This right here is a first flush diverter right here. So what this does is water will come down into this, and the first flush of rain we don't want to keep for later use. That first flush of rain, especially after a long summer of fall of no rainwater, we get a lot of heavy metal pollutants built up on our roofs. When the rain first hits that, all of that washes away, and we don't want to store that. So when that hits it, it actually goes into this canister that can be opened at the bottom and released. But until this fills up and this sort of wiffle ball thing comes all the way up and clogs this so that the next water that comes through gets diverted into the tank, that's what's actually happening. It's very important to make sure that you're not collecting the really polluted water. Some examples of tanks. Typically, the less expensive ones are some sort of polyethylene. You can get tanks up to 10,000 gallons. You can also use fiberglass tanks. You can get tanks that are fiberglass up to 15,000 gallons. Of course, the fiberglass tanks are more costly. And finally, corrugated steel tanks. You can get up to 60,000 gallons of storage out of these. And again, they're more costly. General rule of thumb is roughly $1 to $1.50 per gallon for storage when you're purchasing the actual tank itself. So if it's a 10,000 gallon polyethylene tank, you're looking at probably about $10,000. So some other options. A lot of times in our normal residential settings, we don't necessarily have a ton of room to store a bunch of barrels. So there's alternative tank systems that you can use that are narrow tanks that you can fit on side yards and under roof eaves. And then if you've got the room, but you don't want to spend the actual area in the landscape with the tanks, you can use fiberglass tanks for underground storage or storing them under structures like decks, etc. It's important to calculate your roof watershed for each downspout when you're considering using these systems. And simple methods for doing this is determine the storage location and location of the downspout. So if you're considering doing water storage or rainwater harvesting into tanks on your property, consider where around the structure you can place that tank, given how large it's going to be. Identify which roof areas collect into the gutters that feed that downspout. So when you're identifying that, you have to pick a spot that tank can actually be placed permanently. And then wherever that tank is going to be placed, you want to look at the downspouts that service that area of the roof itself. And with some simple calculations, you can figure out what the potential volume of water could be that you could collect off of that. Now, when you measure the square footage of that roof that's potentially going to feed the downspout that's going to fill your tank, you want to measure it sort of as the crow flies or in plan view. Don't take into account the angle of the roof because you're looking at square footage of area that rain will fall. The fact that that roof is angled doesn't increase the amount of surface area from a plan view standpoint. So you want to be able to figure out your square footage of whatever of the roof that downspout is servicing, and then do a simple calculation where roof area is A, and you can figure out what the actual potential, what the square footage is. So that 200, in this case, 252 square feet. And then you can multiply it by 62 and divide it by 100. And that will give you how many gallons you can collect in a 1-inch rain event. Okay, so simple calculations are necessary. Now, if you find that sweet spot for the storage tank on your property, and then you do the calculation and you realize that, hey, that's going to collect a ton of water, that's going to be larger than a storage tank could be that you could fit in that area, or that you want to spend the money on, then don't get stressed out about that. Don't feel like you have to do a 20,000 gallon tank. As I mentioned before, any little bit helps. Okay, so if that tank gets filled up, that tank gets filled up. You can use it during drier periods of the winter and then try to reuse it and then fill it up before last rains. Okay, so you don't have to do as large as the amount of water as you can collect. Do as big as you feel comfortable with from a financial standpoint, as well as the standpoint of actually fitting that storage tank within that space. The nice thing is Sacramento has some rebates for rain barrels. So 75 cents per gallon up to $150. for 200-gallon capacities. Okay, now keep in mind that is not a rebate that rebates labor or equipment or other materials. The rebate is only for the storage tank itself. Okay, so if you buy a 150-gallon tank, you could get a potential rebate of 3/4 of that. So you'd get about $112 rebate. If you got a 200-gallon tank, you'd get a full $150 rebate, but it maxes at 150. So there's programs out there that organizations are looking at saying, hey, we really need to reduce the amount of stormwater running off into our waterways. So keep that in mind. It's encouraged to do this. And there's programs out there to help you financially for it. Now we're going to talk about mulch basins. Mulch basin benefits are that it increases shallow and deep water infiltration into your soil, reduces the amount of stormwater flowing into our waterways, helps break down pollutants by improving soil structure and health. Mulch basins shall be sized in accordance with table 1504.1. Luckily, we have that right here. And of sufficient depth, length, and width to prevent ponding or runoff during gray water surge. Mulch must be replenished as required. Now, you can utilize mulch basins if you install a gray water system. You can also utilize mulch basin systems without gray water. Okay, so we're going to talk about kind of both of them hand in hand. This table right here helps you determine, given the soil type that you've got, what the minimum number of emitters, if you're doing gray water, would be per gallon of estimated gray water discharge per day. Okay, so you can utilize this if you're going to create some mulch basins and you're implementing a gray water system. Utilize this table. So mulch basins create moisture banks. This is an excavated mulch basin so that you can see it. That will get filled up with mulch. And you can see what's been done here. Gray water is being piped through this. And as gray water is produced in the home, it gets piped through this and then through some emitters, and it fills up these basins, which drives water into the ground for infiltration as well as for the benefit of the plant itself. Here's some different setups for using gray water for mulch basins. And here you can see that these basins have been filled with mulch. So if you're implementing a gray water system, this works great. This is a great way to drop that piping below grade so that it's not damaged. And because we're constantly producing gray water from the home, we need somewhere for that water to go to and to be able to infiltrate into the soil. And mulch basins are a great strategy to do so. You can also implement mulch basins without the use of gray water. You could divert some drainage water into these mulch basins. You could set up mulch basins around fruit trees or other plants so that you can fill that with water and let it percolate into the soil. And when rainwater hits it, it's going to fill that up and percolate down in the soil without having any standing water. Okay, so intensive applications, and then you can also take a much more light-handed approach to mulch basins. Now we're going to talk about rain gardens. Benefits to rain gardens are very similar to mulch basins in that they increase shallow and deep water infiltration into your soil. They reduce the amount of stormwater flowing into our waterways. They help break down pollutants by improving soil structure and health. and they provide habitat for beneficial insects and birds. Essentially, we're creating mini riparian corridors and mounds within our urban environment. And that's attractive for a lot of different biodiversity, which helps us in our landscapes. Rain garden basics. Keep water on the site for as long as is practicable. Ensure no standing water for longer than 48 hours. Reason for that is we don't want to end up with any mosquito issues. The depth of the water when it's fully saturated and filled shouldn't be any deeper than 18 inches. If you're deeper than 18 inches, essentially it's considered a pool, and then we have a liability on our hands. We don't want children or people falling into it and not able to get up and out. You do not want it closer than 10 feet from the foundation of a structure, okay? So heavy judgment call on that. The rule of thumb is get it at least 10 feet away from a structure. Next one here, the inlet into the garden shouldn't cause any erosion, and the outlet from the garden should ensure that maximum of 18 inches of pooling depth, and there should be no erosion in the event of an overflow. Okay, so very important in these systems that we do not have erosion going into that system, because if we've got a heavier clay soil and we get infiltration of that clay into this system, we're going to reduce the amount of water holding capacity in that system. So looking at rain gardens, and generally these are really beautiful things. A lot of times we see them in larger scale developments as stormwater basins, but we can implement these in our landscapes for beauty and function as well. Now, when we're planning these out, we want to look at these basins in a couple different zones. The bottom of the basin, considered zone, the low zone, is the wet zone. And there's certain types of plants that thrive in those conditions. Those types of plants are plants that can withstand being fully saturated and immersed in water for short periods of time. There's also the mid zone, which is sometimes called the shoulder of the rain garden. And those plants used there can take water for very short periods of time, but like to dry out between. And then there's the high zone, which is up and out of the rain garden. Those plants benefit from the added water adjacent to them, but don't necessarily like being 100% saturated for short periods of time. If we're looking at what plants to select for those different zones, the go-to plants for rain garden low zones are plants like juncus, chondropetalum, and a lot of caryxes. Okay, juncuses, there's a lot of them that are available locally that are native juncuses, or they're cultivated varieties of native juncuses. There's many native sedges, the caryxes, Caryx barbaraceae, and then there's Caryx tumulicola divulsa. If you are a native plant enthusiast, we know that one of these is the California native and one is from Europe. That's a pretty heavy native plant debate to have, and either one will do. If you're a native plant purist, select the native. If you're less of a native plant purist, use your best judgment. Other plants that do great really in the low zone, and these plants also do great in the mid zone and high zone, are non-natives like chondropetalum, which is Cape rush. These get a little bit larger, but the beauty of these plants is they can withstand heavy saturation for short periods of time. They work really well in almost any soil, and they can also accept dry conditions too. So very versatile plant to use in the low zone. But here's some examples of plants in the low zone. Later on in the presentation, there's going to be some links to some different plant lists that you can get more plants off of, and then a couple tables with some additional plants. So you can really explore which plants you might want to put in the low zone of your rain garden. For our mid zones, plants like monkey flower and nasturtium, watercress, yerba buena, these are all great plants to go on the shoulders or in that mid zone. The high zone plants, plants like Grindelia, Douglas iris, the Iris douglasiana, which is a native, not necessarily of the Sacramento region, more coastal, but since we're setting this up with some benefits of additional water, these do really well. Also coyote mint and monardella, so great plants for the high zones. There's a lot of plants that work incredibly well for the high zone. So there's quite a longer list for that. Coast strawberry, epilobium, our California fuchsia, our achilleas, our yarrows. Adjacent to these rain gardens, so outside of those zones, it's really nice to incorporate some other natives. So sambucas, ribes, and spice bushes. These are larger, woodier shrubs. But the beauty of incorporating these types of plants into these areas is that when you're creating this, using some natives, you're creating habitat for insects and animals, birds, and all sorts of little critters. Now, if you can incorporate some other native plants that provide food for those native critters, you're really creating an amazing ecosystem that those critters will stay around year long because there's food, water, shelter, and a place to raise their young. And those are really the 4 key ingredients to creating habitat. Other plants for adjacent to rain gardens, western dogwoods, Oregon grape, toyon. So a lot of plants that do really well with that. Other plants to consider are Muhlenbergia rigens. Sorry about the typo there. Might as well take care of that. Muhlenbergia rigens are deer grass, penstemon, beautiful plant, amazing flowers, and our western redbuds. Also, some other ones that we could utilize are California bentgrass, sea thrift, Celine, right? So there's all sorts of different plants that we can incorporate into these to be able to create habitat and beauty. Some resources for rain gardens provided by SSQP, our Sacramento Stormwater Quality Partnership. There's planting guidance in that design manual. So you can get to that, look up some planting guidance for plants to select. Also on CalFlora, you can go on to calflora.com and you can put in search for riparian plants in your area. And essentially what that'll do is you can put in an area, being Sacramento County, and put in that you're looking for riparian plants. And what that'll do is it'll give you a list of riparian plants that naturally occur in our region, which is really cool. If you think back before levees were built, etc., this whole area was a lot of riparian area. And there's a lot of plants that work incredibly well that are native that we can incorporate into our rain gardens. Now, right here is that link to Sacramento native plants for rain gardens. This is from harvestingrainwater.com. And you can follow this link and get to those lists. And here's some tables of those lists. Of course, we can't see it that well because it's so small, but use some resources to really research which plants you want to incorporate into your rain garden and aim for native first. Aim for native first. It's really great to incorporate natives into these systems. Now, if you're considering putting in a rain garden, here's an example of a plan. You can see that the different zones are outlined here. Okay, so low zone, mid zone, and then high zone. Here we've got low zone, mid zone, and high zone. And then here are some keyed in plants for which plants are incorporated into these systems. Okay, so depending on the area that you're working with, you can have an inlet, whether that's coming from cisterns or traveling across the landscape, or you're diverting your downspouts to this. You've got the inlet coming in, and then you've got an outlet that, again, we don't want erosion, and we want to make sure that the pooling doesn't go any higher than 18 inches and doesn't stand for more than 48 hours. You can do swaled rain gardens. This is an example of a swaled rain garden. You've got some flow lines, you got circulation and drainage, you've got rock gradation, which we'll look at in just a couple minutes here. You've got erosion and deposition. And this is a really cool graphic of how you can make a swaled rain garden look really natural. Now, one of the really amazing things about our Sacramento region is we've got these amazing rivers that travel through it. And if we step back and look at how water travels and creates a river basin, right? When water moves or turns in a river or creek, it's always going around something that's harder than the water itself. Of course, water erodes, but if it's slamming up against a large rock or a large rock embankment, it's going to turn and find the path of least resistance and continue on. So this is just an aerial shot of the American River, and we see how this twists and turns. But when we're considering creating a swaled rain garden and we want it to look really natural, we want to take this into account. So we've got flow line gravel that comes through, and you can see here that some larger rocks were placed. And essentially, if water were to flow through here in a river setting or a high flow situation, that water would hit these larger boulders and turn, and hit these larger boulders and turn, and hit these larger boulders and turn. And what we get are deeper spots and shallower spots and different sizes of rocks and gravel that can be incorporated. So it can be pretty tricky to really create something that looks wonderfully natural. But if you can use strategies that Mother Nature has taught us, that's really a great way to implement that. Now, that's actually creating the basin itself, right? Now, if we consider it, we want to look at what types of plants we might put in there. So we can look at emergent riparian areas in our deeper spots where we would have that water rushing through and creating some deeper pools. We can have some meadow spaces adjacent to it. We can have chaparral feeling plants or chaparral plant community plants up and out of that in the outskirts and adjacent to it. So you can play with how these look and how you're creating this overall sense of feel and sense of place, and really think through it. But I really like to utilize the way that nature did it. Okay, so look at the way that natural rivers flow and try to mimic that in your swaled rain garden. Now, when you're creating these dry creek bed or swaled rain gardens, and sometimes you can create a dry creek bed that carries the water from wherever your downspouts are pushing into or wherever your landscape drains to, and eventually this goes to a rain garden. Now, rock gradation or sizes of the gravel, if you can switch up the sizes, you get a much more natural looking system. So you can see here, there's some larger cobbles, some bigger boulders on the shoulder here, and then some more finely graded gravels that go in between. And if you go out to the river or the creeks and you look at them in the drier season, you're going to see what this really looks like. And the goal is to try to replicate it. A really good way to actually execute the installation on this is to go in and put in your boulders first on those spots where you're going to have turns that encourages that water to turn and turn because it can't erode those boulders. And then place some of the larger cobble down first, and then infill with smaller gravel until you're filling up a little bit around the border of, or around the perimeter of those larger cobbles, okay? Again, it's a little bit tricky. It's a bit of an art, but it sure is fun. And being able to create a really natural setting is really, really nice in the landscape. So sizing and planning your rain garden. You want to locate your rain garden first. Okay, so find a low area on the property to maximize the amount of water that you can direct to it. Try to make sure that this basin edge is no closer than 10 feet from the foundation of any structure. Now, sizing your rain garden. The rain garden should be 17 to 34% as large as the impervious surfaces that it's directed to. The lower end of that 17%. So if you're looking at sizing your rain garden, if you have a really sandy, fast draining soil, you can go on the lighter end of that percentage range. What that means is if you have a really sandy soil, that soil is going to be able to take a lot more water a lot faster than a clay soil. So you can have a smaller rain garden in that case. If you have really clayey soil, then 34% of the impervious surface. So if you have 1,000 square feet of impervious surface that's getting directed to this area, and you have a clayey soil, we do 1,000 square feet times 34%, we get 340 square feet is how big that basin should be, okay? Now, assessing your soil in order to determine this, the way that you can do this really simply, sure, you can send off your soil to a lab. It's not crazy expensive, and you get a lot of great information out of it. Be sure to ask for the organic assessment so that if they're recommending any kind of nutritional supplements, they're recommending organic supplements instead of quick release petroleum-based fertilizers. Now, if you want to do this yourself, go ahead and dig a hole wherever that basin's going to be installed, at least 12 inches deep, okay? Do about a 12-inch wide by 12-inch deep hole and fill that water to the full depth of 12 inches, okay? Full 12 inches. If you dig it a little bit deeper, fill it up to 12 inches and allow that water to completely infiltrate into the soil. After it's completely infiltrated into the soil and there's moisture in that soil, but there's no standing water, fill that hole up again to 12 inches. And once it's filled, start timing how long it takes for that water to completely infiltrate into the soil again. What that's going to do for you is it's going to give you a really accurate read of when the soil is saturated, how quickly that water can actually infiltrate into that soil. So you take that time and you divide it by the depth of water, 12 inches, by the number, you take the depth of water and divide that by the number of hours it took to fully infiltrate. So as an example, if you've saturated that soil, it's drained out, and then you fill it up again, and then you time how long it takes for that to actually infiltrate all the way into the soil. If that ended up taking 24 hours, you take the 12 inches and you divide it by 24 hours, and you get a 1/2 inch infiltration rate per hour. If your soil drains in less than 24 hours, you have a pretty adequate infiltration rate to not have to amend the soil. If your soil takes longer than the 24 hours to drain, then consider making the garden larger so it can hold more water at a much shallower depth. Or if you don't have that much space, consider digging down an additional 12 to 18 inches, pulling that soil out, and then replacing that removed soil with a blend of compost, sand, and loam. Okay. This is at our bulk supply vendors in the Sacramento region, most regions in California, in fact. It's called a prepared topsoil. And what that is a blend of compost and a sandy loam. And it tends to drain really quickly, but it's got a good amount of compost in it to support the plants that you're going to plant in there. Finally, you've planned out where it's going to go. You've decided how long how large it's going to be, how deeply you need to dig. Before you dig, call 811. It is a fast and free service that can save you a ton of headache. So what this is it's a service that you call in, you request a utility inspection, and you mark out the area that you're going to be excavating with white paint. Sometimes within 6 hours, utility professionals will show up. It usually takes, I think that it's up to 4 days that they have to come and mark the areas. You need to mark the area with white marking paint where you're going to be excavating. So mark the entire perimeter of that rain garden. Call 811. You'll get PG&E or SMUD coming out. You'll get cable companies coming out, water companies coming out, and they're going to mark where their lines are. Okay. And if they mark through your excavation, it doesn't mean that you can't do the excavation. It means that you need to be very careful when you dig. Okay. If you're not careful when you dig and you don't call 811, there's a pretty good chance that you're going to end up digging into a utility line, which can be incredibly dangerous and incredibly costly. So use this fast and free service, call 811. Safety first. Okay, I talked earlier about inlets and outlets. Really focus on protecting your foundation and avoiding any soil erosion. So at the bottom of the downspouts, if you're directing those downspouts to a rain garden, use some splash blocks or energy dissipators. You can use some cobble or some gravel or splash blocks in order to disperse the energy of that water and reduce the amount of erosion that can potentially happen. Okay, so that's it for rain gardens. There's a lot to it. They are beautiful systems. You can incorporate amazing native plants, create habitat, and in the process, reduce the volume of water going into our waterways and the pollutant loading. Because when you're setting up these systems, the pollutants will settle into that planted area, and the life in that soil will actually break down those pollutants. The result is that clean water infiltrates into your subsoil, and any runoff that goes off is going off with less volume, and it's much cleaner. Now, the final strategy for rainwater harvesting is using porous pavement. Benefits to this is that it increases shallow and deep water infiltration into your soil, and it reduces the amount of stormwater flowing into our waterways. So really similar advantages and benefits to all these different systems and strategies that we can use. So pervious versus impervious hardscapes. Different types of permeable surfaces. There's porous concrete, which you see here. There's porous asphalt, porous pavers. Sorry about the typo here. There's porous gravel. And then there's some subsurface requirements that we're going to look at. Okay, so when we're looking at pervious asphalt and concrete, pervious asphalt is a different type of asphalt mix that allows water to flow through it. Okay, pervious concrete, it's still concrete, but no sand is used. So the result is a little bit of a Rice Krispie treat looking concrete that acts and functions just like concrete, but it allows water to flow directly through it. When you're using systems like this, of course, you can color them, you can make them look a little bit different, you can dress them up, use different aggregates. So a lot of options with this. Porous pavers. Now, when you have porous pavers, it's important that there's some sort of subsurface drainage for it to actually work. Okay, so the majority of the paver manufacturers all have permeable interlocking concrete systems now, and there's a lot of ways to do it. The build on them is similar to traditional or conventional paver systems, but instead of having very tight butted joints filled up with some sort of sand or polymeric sand that is impermeable, instead there's larger gaps between the pavers themselves, and they're filled with typically a manufactured pea gravel. This allows water to flow directly through that and then through a graded sand and then through an open graded base reservoir into an open graded sub-base reservoir. This is relatively intensive, but any good paving or concrete and masonry company can put these systems together for you. And if you think back several slides ago about our urban settings and how much impermeable surface there is, the more we can reduce our impermeable surfaces, the higher the benefit is for our waterways. And these permeable pavers are very attractive. They're very nice looking, different types of permeable pavers. Here's some from Calstone, some from Belgard, some from Basalite. Finally, what I'd really like to talk about, skipped over it, are gravel surfaces. So permeable concrete, permeable asphalt, permeable pavers, these are all amazing products. They're a little bit on the expensive side, as is any kind of installation in the landscape. Gravel surfaces, a lot of times we forget about using gravel surfaces. Now, you can do gravel surfaces and they are permeable. You can use them for walkways, patios, all sorts of different applications. And you can do traditional installations. Now, the traditional installation is just gravel, ideally on some sort of compacted permeable base rock. Now, a lot of times people don't like gravel surfaces because when they're installed way too deep. The gravel is 1.5 to 3 inches deep. And when you're walking through that loose gravel, it's a lot like walking through soft sand, which can be really challenging and sort of uncomfortable. My best recommendation, and in many installations that I've done, the best thing you can do if you're going to do a traditional installation is do 2 to 3 inches of compacted permeable base rock. And on top of that, just do a 1-inch layer of gravel. That 1-inch layer of gravel on top of a compacted rock is much easier to walk through. This is probably the least expensive way that you can create a walkable, usable surface that is permeable. Now, if you like gravel, but you want it as a really solid surface, you can do a gravel reinforcement installation. Here's some products that you see. There's a lot of products out there. The cost range, depending on how much you're buying, is between $2 and $5 per square foot. Now, what an application like this does is that when you walk on this surface, it feels as hard as concrete, but it looks and sounds like gravel. And essentially what it is, there's a bunch of, typically it's a polyethylene product that's about an inch deep, and you put that down on a compacted base rock, and then you fill that up with gravel. Now here you can see that it's completely filled with gravel. This portion is exposed. In this instance, you see that it's not, it's completely filled, but it's not covered. I prefer to cover it so I don't see it, but it still walks and performs exactly the same. Huge benefit to it is it's 100% permeable, and it's ADA accessible. And if you get the heavier duty ones, it's also fire truck accessible as well. Okay, so a lot of times, again, we don't think of using gravel. A lot of times people shy away from gravel because if it's installed too deep, it's very difficult to walk on. So go thin with the gravel layer, go thick and compact with a permeable base rock layer. And then if you really want a solid walking and driving and ADA accessible surface, use one of the reinforcement methods, okay? Again, lower on the expense. Generally, if you add reinforcement to this, it ends up being about the same cost as a plain broom finish concrete. So there's also things that we can think about when we're looking at permeable surfaces that we may not have considered. Some alternate driveways, right? So a lot of our driveways, we're driving our cars onto them, and it's 20 feet wide of all concrete. But think about this. Your tires only hit a little portion of that entire area of concrete. Transition that to drive strips, right? Making a transition like this, even if you're not using permeable pavement or some other permeable system, this is a significant reduction in the amount of impermeable surface on your property. And as I mentioned before, every single little bit significantly helps. You can also use turf block for it and put in gravel within that, or put in plants. Okay, there's a lot of different things that you can do. And again, every little bit helps. Now, going through all these strategies, ways to implement, things you need to think about. Again, some of these very intensive and some of these very lightly or not intensive at all. Again, anything you can do helps. What really helps to help you visualize it if you can go and see some of these systems in demonstration gardens. So there's a lot of local resources. Demonstration gardens are one of the best ways to learn about them. City of Sacramento Department of Utilities demonstration garden is a great spot to go and look. The Elk Grove Rain Gardens are a great spot to go look. Laguna Creek Watershed Council, great spot. And then just do some general internet searches for some things that other people have done. There's always wonderful and creative ways to implement these strategies, which, again, we think of in terms of how is it benefiting our property? And certainly there's massive benefits to our property. But let's step back again and think about this. Remember, when our natural settings become urban settings, our runoff becomes excessively high in volume as well as pollutant loads. Any strategies that we can implement to reduce the amount of runoff volume and the pollutant loading becomes a wonderful green filter to our landscapes, to our soils, and takes the heavy burden off of our natural waterways and our storm drain systems. So I hope this is informative for you. I really hope and encourage you to go out and implement whatever of these strategies make the most sense for your property. Good luck out there, and thank you guys so much for being interested and watching.